Om Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We're working our way through Book 2, which is on spiritual practice, on sadhana. And we were in the middle of discussing the second limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limbed yoga, the second limb being Niyama. We already discussed the 5 yamas in detail. The yamas are the don'ts. Don't do X, Y, and Z, those 5 things. Don't injure others, etc., etc. Don't lie. And the niyamas, the second limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, are the do's, the things that we should do as spiritual aspirants to make spiritual progress and to attain the highest goal. And last class, we discussed the first 2 of the 5 niyamas. So what are these 5 niyamas? I've listed them on the board. And, sorry, just a second. Okay, so the first one is shaucha. Somebody was making fun of my handwriting, so my apologies if it's not legible. It's my bad. Shaucha, that's what's written up there, and it means purity. And we discussed how there are 2 forms of it. External purity is relatively easier. You just shower and you kind of groom yourself. You wear clean clothes and so on. But internal purity is the really difficult one. And it encompasses both. Okay. Second, santosha, contentment, and we discussed that at length as well. True happiness is not about how much we own, what we have, but whether we're content with what we do have. And so if somebody has a ton of money but desires even more stuff and even more money, they're much less happy than somebody who's basically, extremely poor by comparison, but who's content with what he or she has. Okay, so we discussed that last time. We're going to discuss today the 3 remaining niyamas. Okay. And they all require quite a bit of explanation, it seems to me. But the way I would, if you look at all 5 as a whole, I see these first, this is just my own take, and it's not from Bryant or from the commentators, but I think we could group these first 3 into, so shaucha, internal and external purity, santosha, contentment, and tapa, austerity, as sort of foundational practices. For everybody. And all of you know, I'm sure, the 4 yogas, right? So Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Karma Yoga. Okay. So these are foundational practices that are important, kind of central to, or foundational for all 4 of the yogas. Okay. And then, if we look at the 4th limb, the 4th limb is Swadhyaya, okay? And it actually, the commentators explain that Swadhyaya has 2 different dimensions. One of them is study of scriptures that talk about liberation, and I would put that in the Jnana Yoga category, okay? The path of knowledge. But Swadhyaya also includes mantra japa, mental repetition of a mantra. What's the mantra? The standard mantra recommended by Patanjali? If you remember this from the previous book, book 1, it's not, you can guess. It's like, yeah, good guess, exactly. Right, Om. And then other commentators expand that out to include any number of mantras, divine mantras basically. It could be Om Namah Shivaya or Hare Krishna or Ramakrishna mantra, whatever it is. And it seems to me that mantra japa, the mantra japa dimension of Swadhyaya, is a combination of Bhakti Yoga, because you're doing japa, you're repeating japa, the name of God, and Raja Yoga, which is what this text is all about. The focus is meditation, right? So if you're initiated in our tradition, your guru tells you to do mantra japa, but at the same time, concentrate on the image of God in your heart. So that's the meditation side of mantra japa as well. So it seems to me that mantra japa combines bhakti yoga and raja yoga. The study of scriptures is jnana yoga. And then what's the one remaining one? Karma yoga. We get that in the fifth limb. I mean, sorry, not the fifth limb. The fifth niyama in the second limb of the Ashtanga yoga. Ishvara Pranidhana. I'm giving you a summary now, and then we're going to go into details. Ishvara Pranidhana means two things, according to the commentators. First, devotion and surrender to God. Obviously, that falls under Bhakti Yoga. But it also means, according to the traditional commentators, offering all of one's actions to God. And here we get Karma Yoga, the fourth yoga. So I think the last two Niyamas, Swadhyaya and Ishvara Pranidhana, really beautifully synthesize, harmonize all four of the yogas. And the first three Niyamas, internal and external purity, contentment, and austerity, are foundational disciplines that apply to all four of the yogas. Okay? That's how I see this. And so, taken as a whole, just look at this. I mean, it's so comprehensive. It gives us a kind of comprehensive scheme of spiritual practices for our day-to-day spiritual life. That's how I see it. So it's extremely practical and extremely helpful. But let's dive a little bit more deeply into these last three niyamas. So first, let's look at the third one, austerity. This is page 253. Before we go into it, sorry, I usually do this and I forgot to do it this time. I normally announce the next class or classes. I don't know when the next class is because our December schedule has not yet been determined. So just keep your eyes peeled. For, maybe in a few days we'll know. But it'll be sometime in December, that's for sure, because I'll be away for 2 weeks almost. So, page 253 from Bryant's commentary, and here he explains in one short paragraph austerity, but I'm going to expand it. He says, the next niyama, austerity, tapas, is the ability to tolerate hunger and thirst, as well as all the dualities of life, hot and cold, etc., to avoid useless talk, and to perform fasts. Hariharananda says, so he's a modern yoga commentator, he says that yoga requires one to tolerate sufferings of the body, endure hardships, and remain undisturbed by the lack of physical comfort. He cautions, however, that inflicting hardship on the body in the form of voluntary austerity and penance should be undertaken only for the expiation of sins and not otherwise. Okay. So first let's look at what Bryant's saying, and then we can talk about other understandings, broader understandings of austerity. So what he's emphasizing, based on the traditional commentaries, is that austerity is basically depriving yourself of creature comforts, as far as I can tell. As a way of kind of helping you to endure and ultimately to transcend the dualities. Life is full of dualities, happiness, sadness, but at a grosser level, right now it's, what is it? Actually, it's pretty pleasant right now, but it's always pleasant in LA usually. But in India, it's often extremely hot, for instance. And so the austerity, when you're living in an extremely hot climate, is endure the heat, right? And if you're in a very cold climate, you endure the cold. Try to be unaffected by both. The idea behind fasting is kind of similar, right? Deprive yourself of food for a certain fixed amount of time, just as a way of kind of disciplining the body and the bodily appetites. So what's the point in all this? And of course, you'll see in India and maybe other countries as well, some yogis and tapasvis, people practicing austerities, go to extreme lengths doing what seem to be kind of weird things, like piercing their body and having heavy things hanging off their skin, walking on a bed of nails, standing on one leg for years or decades at a time, like really intense stuff. You might think that's kind of weird. But what's the basic idea? The basic principle is all of these things are meant to help us to break our identification with the body, with the physical body. We're so closely identified with the body that we just instinctively try to pamper it. Right? We always are inclined toward bodily gratification, right? Hot showers and this and that. And so if you we normally take hot showers, right? So one day if let's say that there's no hot water, so you have to shower in cold water, right? If you're not used to it, it's going to feel absolutely terrible. And you'll try to get out as quickly as possible, right? But if you're used to doing it as an austerity once in a while, it's not going to bother you so much, right? You're like, yeah, who cares? Right? So I think it's good, especially in a country like the US, which is we're in the kind of living in the lap of luxury. I think it's good, even at the gross level of austerity, to just kind of undergo some hardships as a way of kind of pushing against this tendency to gratify the body and to depend too much on, expect creaturely comforts at all times, you know. But that's at a very gross level. What I would suggest is, now, I don't want you to pounce on me and say, you're a lazy harmonizer. So I should preface this by saying, I think the commentators emphasize these kinds of austerities, physical austerities of the sort described here, fasting and so on, bodily hardships. I want to bring in what I think is a more spiritually fruitful and broader understanding of tapas, austerity, from a Vedantic perspective, okay? So I want to make this clear, flag it, that this is a Vedantic take on austerity. You don't necessarily find the commentators talking about this, although some of them might, because some commentators, like Vijnana Bhikshu, he was a Vedantin actually, and so he'll sometimes quote Vedantic texts. And so the text I want to present to you is the Bhagavad Gita, because in chapter 17 of the Gita, Krishna explains 3 kinds of tapas. Okay? Maybe I should write that too. So it's chapter 17, verses 14 to 16. So Bhagavad Gita, oh boy. Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow, this is not good. Okay. Okay, so 3 kinds of austerity. The first is bodily austerity. The second is austerity of speech, vangmayam. And the third is mental austerity, austerity of mind. Okay, so how does Bhagavan Krishna define these 3 kinds of austerity? Let's take them one at a time. So first, physical austerity. And you might be surprised if you're not familiar with this definition, how different physical austerity is defined by Krishna compared to how it's defined in the Yoga Sutra, okay? Deva Dvija Guru Pragya Pujanam Shaucham Arjavam Brahmacharyam Himsacha Shariram Tapa Uchyate. Okay. So Krishna says physical austerity consists in these practices. Number 1, worshipping, showing reverence toward whom? Deva, gods, gods and goddesses. Dvija, those who are spiritual people, saintly people. Dvija, guru, your guru, showing reverence and worship toward your guru. Prajna, wise people. Okay, so that's the first practice. Deva, Dvija, Guru, Prajna, Pujanam. Worship of people who are holy. Why does that count as a physical austerity? Because it requires that you bend the knee, literally. And this again is something that is especially useful in the West, because in Eastern cultures, it's common to do that, right? But in the West, it's like we feel reluctant to take the dust of another person's feet. Like, who are they, God? And but it's good. Literally bending the knee and physically expressing your worship and your love and your reverence is remarkable, and it actually changes the mind because of this important body-mind connection. What the body does, that actually affects what the mind does, and what the mind does, that also affects the body. So there's a feedback loop going in both directions. Okay. So that's the first practice under physical austerity. Then we have, so Deva, Dvija, Guru, Pragya, Pujanam, and then Shaucham. Notice, interesting, same word. Shaucham, which is the first of the 5 Niyamas in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Okay? But since Krishna is talking about physical austerities, clearly what he has in mind is the external side of cleanliness or purity, emphasized in Patanjali. Okay? So keep yourself clean and so on. Groomed, well-groomed. Okay. But then there's a very interesting one. The next practice under physical austerity is Arjavam. Arjavam means, usually it's understood in a kind of metaphorical sense as an ethical quality, integrity. Having a kind of innate dignity, self-respect, somebody who always uncompromisingly follows their principles. They're not namby-pamby and, going where the wind blows, that kind of person. But again, why in the world would that fall under physical austerity? This is also quite interesting. Because literally, it means somebody who sits upright and stands, is straight, basically. And I'm reminded of the very interesting contemporary research done by a Harvard professor in the business school, I think, at Harvard. Her name is Amy Cuddy. Has anyone watched any of her videos? It's very interesting. She's done really interesting research on what she calls power poses. And she found that there are a lot of young women and even older women, and when they apply for leadership positions in companies, they often fare much worse than their male counterparts. And she wanted to look at why. And what she found is that often women tend to lack self-confidence. And so when they're being interviewed for these kinds of high-level positions, whether it's CEO, CFO, or whatever, they tend to lose out to their more confident male counterparts because the interviewers will prefer somebody in a leadership role who is full of confidence and vigor. And so what she found was she took some of these women and she said, stand in Wonder Woman pose for, I think it was 3 minutes, and she timed it. Wonder Woman pose is you hold your arms like this and your legs spread apart. And they just held that pose for 3 minutes, and she checked their brain signals, the brain activity. And what she found is quite remarkable, because it actually changed the levels of hormones in the system. And it made them, as a result, it made them gain in self-confidence, and they were better able to cope with stress than before they entered that power pose. And they did better as a result in these kinds of job interviews and so on. And so it's a long kind of detour, but it's relevant, because now coming back to Arjavam, I think what Krishna understood way back, this is ancient Vedantic wisdom, is that even how we carry ourselves literally at the level of the body has effects on our emotions and our mental well-being, our emotional and mental well-being. Another example, I talked about this in another talk. What was the talk? Oh, fake it till you make it. That's what I talked about. But in India, when I was in Belur for a number of years, at 6 o'clock in the morning, every day, as far as I remember, exactly on cue, there was just a group of people right behind where I lived at the university going, ha, 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 ha. It was like group laughter. It sounded really canned. And I was just so confused. And then I found out later that it was a laughing club, and that these laughing clubs are ubiquitous in India, or at least they used to be when I was there. I'm talking about 2010 to 13-ish kind of. And it's the same idea. People who have health issues, who are dealing with stress, who have a difficult, challenging family life or work life, they come to these laughing clubs and they just laugh together about nothing in particular. I don't think they're watching Seinfeld, they're just laughing. And it's amazing, because if you go on YouTube and type in Indian laughing clubs, you're going to find, you can interview these people. The people were interviewed, and they say, well, how does it help you? And they're like, it's reduced my blood pressure. I'm no longer a diabetic. I mean, they'll just say all these things. I'm happier. I have a better mood, and this and that. Because literally the act of smiling, even if you have nothing to smile about, even if you're miserable, but literally the act of smiling will make you happier as a result. It's remarkable because of the way it changes the brain chemistry. Am I the only one who's hot here? I don't know why. Okay, hold on, sorry. Okay, so that's Arjavam. That's the third practice of austerity, physical austerity. So Deva Dvija Guru Prajna Pujanam Shaucham Arjavam. And so, with respect to Arjavam, just even your posture, try to keep your back straight and so on, because that actually has an effect on your emotional and mental state, actually. Okay. Arjavam. Brahmacharyam. Brahmacharyam and ahimsa. These are the last two physical austerities. Notice, those are two of the yamas that we discussed in previous classes, right? So 3 of these physical austerities, out of those, one of them is the first niyama, the external purity side, and then 2 of them are yamas from Patanjali's yamas, okay, brahmacharyam and ahimsa. Brahmacharya means continence, purity in thought, word, and deed, and then ahimsa, non-injury, and we discussed these in detail, okay? And why are they classified under physical austerity? Because it involves restraining the body, the physical body, in certain ways. Because when you commit physical violence, you're using your body to commit physical violence. When you break sexual continence, you're also using the physical body, right? So you have to restrain the body in certain ways. Okay, so that's physical austerity. So I think this gives a kind of deeper Vedantic account of physical austerities. And I'm not saying that it's mutually exclusive with what we talked about in Bryant's commentary. We can do those too, and that can also be helpful, doing periodic fasts and so on. The Indian Prime Minister Modi is famous for observing fasts quite regularly on religious occasions. Okay, but then the next one, the next kind of austerity is Vāṅmayam Tapa. Deva Dvija Guru Prajna. Oh wait, sorry, that's what I just said. Okay. Anudvegakaram Vakyam Satyam Priyatam Chayat Swadhyayabhasanam Chaiva Vāṅmayam Tapuchade. Okay. So okay, this is really tricky. So austerity of speech. How can you be austere in speech? Well, here's how your speech should be. It should have the following qualities. Anudvegakaram. It shouldn't disturb others. What you say should not disturb others. Okay. Now, maybe we can do it this way. Like, as soon as I give a quality, be the devil's advocate and say like, but aren't there circumstances when you have to be a little bit harsh? And let's come up with an example. Well, anyone who has a child will know that sometimes you have to speak a little bit harshly in order to raise your child properly. You can't just always coddle the child and, oh, please don't do that, because your kid's not gonna listen to you, right? So a parent might justify in that way. Okay, so it gets complicated, but let's continue with the adjectives and then we can see how it all, because austerity of speech means your speech has to exhibit all of these characteristics. Number 1, anudvegakaram. It should never disturb anyone else. Vakyam. Vakyam means speech. Satyam. It should at the same time be truthful. Now it gets even trickier. Because now it's, okay, theoretically, you can avoid ever using disturbing speech, but at the expense of truthfulness sometimes, right? If you feel that you have to speak a harsh, unpleasant truth to somebody for their own good, it might be disturbing, right? But if you don't place a premium on truthfulness, then you can always speak gently and softly and whatever. Okay. So it gets a little complicated how to balance these things. Anudvegakaram, vakyam, satyam, priyahitam. At the same time, your speech should be beneficial to the other person, to the person you're speaking to. Priyahitam chayat. All 3 of these things. So how do you square this circle? Sometimes, I think often we can say that one can pull it off. Okay, but each one of us can come up with scenarios in which one of these 3 conditions at least is going to be sacrificed for the sake of the other 2, right? And we can talk about that if you want. Can you think of any examples, for instance, or do you think that it's easy to pull off observing all 3 of these aspects of austerity of speech at the same time? What do you think?
It's not easy.
Can you give the mic to... Yes.
No, I was just saying, Swami, that it's definitely not easy, but I think if you try to follow the instructions of many, schools of sadhana, then it's something that is almost required, I think. So I think that's the challenge, is, actually being able to do that in the worldly life.
Right. Okay. So it's very challenging, but spiritual life is not meant to be easy. It's like walking on the edge of a razor's blade. And so what do you expect? Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's anyone else have thoughts about this? But do you really think that it's never okay to speak harshly to somebody if it meets the other two things? If you feel that you're being truthful and that what you're saying, in the long run at least, will be beneficial to the other person. Can you give the mic to?
Didn't Thakur tell us that we should hiss but not bite? So
Right.
kind of give us the go-ahead.
Okay, good, exactly. So this hiss but don't bite teaching of Sri Ramakrishna's, there's an interesting question of whether, what does he mean by that? I think what he means by that is you might externally or superficially have to be harsh, right? In order to say what you need to say. But at the same time, there shouldn't be an emotional sting behind it, the emotional reactivity behind it. So even if it seems like you're saying something in anger, scolding your child, for instance, there shouldn't be the bite behind it, right?
So it's the intent more.
Yeah, I think it's more about the intent in a way. And so that's why I think it maybe even these qualities of austerity of speech also need to be nuanced in a certain way. And there might be, to a certain extent, external harshness. You might disturb somebody in the short term, for instance. But as long as you have in mind the other two things, which is that you're being truthful and that you really do you aim to benefit the other person, right? I mean, if you have to bring to a person's attention a certain weakness or something that something in that person that's causing a lot of difficulty or trouble for other people, that may not be a very pleasant thing for that person to hear, right?
But don't you need authority?
Can you give the mic to, I just want the online people to also be able to hear. 1 second, sorry.
I think you also need authority too, though.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you have to be the person whose job it is sort of to say those harsh things if you're going to.
Yeah.
You have to be the guru, or you have to be, it has to be sort of your place.
Right. Okay, that's a great point. So you should be the right person to be delivering that, not necessarily great news. So it depends on the context, I think, presumably. You'd agree with me, right? So yeah, if it's a context of a spiritual aspirant, then yeah, like any random person giving advice may not help. You should probably be their guru, or at least somebody, much more advanced than they are on the spiritual path. Okay, number one. What about, but don't you think like a parent speaking to their child also has that authority as a parent, right? So that's a different context. But so authority means different things in different contexts. And maybe just, even sometimes I think you have to sometimes speak harsh truths to your loved ones in a family. I think that's quite common. I think all of us can think of situations where that's the case. And where they're disturbed. Definitely disturbed, objectively disturbed. But if the intent is to benefit the person, and you're being truthful, and you're doing your best not to unnecessarily antagonize them, then I think arguably the conditions are still met. Maybe. So that's useful that we bring in intent. I think that's a nice way of putting it. Okay, so that's austerity speech, but then we're not done yet. Swadhyaya abhyasanam chaiva. That's the last part of austerity of speech. And notice, swadhyaya, same word as the fourth niyama. So there's a lot of overlap here. And you might be wondering, well, which was one of the texts influenced by the other? We don't really know exactly, because scholars tend to date both the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutra at around the same time. It's a long range of kind of 200 BCE to 200 CE. That's, as I said, scholarly dating. And then, of course, more traditional Indians will date it back much older. Both the texts will be much older, they'll say. So which text might have influenced the other, we don't really know. Or maybe they're both working in the same milieu, using the same kind of spiritual terminology. So there are different possibilities. But some scholars seem to think that the Gita was influenced by Yoga Sutra. And chapter 6 of the Gita mentions a lot of practices that overlap with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and so on. But it is striking that they're the exact same words that are being used again and again in these verses. Okay, we've seen Shaucha, Tapaha's there, Swadhyaya, Brahmacharya, Ahimsa, all these terms which are used in Patanjali's text are also used in these Gita verses. Okay. So Swadhyaya, scriptural study, and mantra japa are also, they fall under austerity of speech because they involve words, right? You're reading words or you're repeating divine words, mantras, in the form of mantras. And then finally, this is the toughest of all the austerities. It's mental austerity. Manaha prasadaha saumyatvam maunam atma vinigraha bhavasam shuddhirityeta tapo manasam urchate. So manasam tapaha, mental austerity, is manah prasadaha. The mind should be tranquil. The mind should be calm. You see how difficult it is. Like, even if I try to make my mind calm, I can shower every day. That's like something that's like easy to do, right, relatively. But how do I make my mind calm? It's not easy. You have to change all sorts of stuff in your mind. And how do you, the mind is like this, what does Swamiji say? The mind is like a monkey which is drunk and which is being bitten by a scorpion. And so how do you make that mind, the monkey mind, tranquil? Not so easy. But that's only the first of the list of qualities involved in mental austerity. Manaha prasadaha, saumyatvam, and a certain gentleness and calmness of bearing, that kind of thing. Saumyatvam. Maunam, this is a kind of quietude. Maunam also can often mean literally observing a vow of silence, for instance, just not speaking. But since this is a mental austerity, this is not an austerity of speech. It seems to mean a kind of, Eckhart Tolle talks about the voice in the head that's constantly yapping away. So quietening that voice in the head, making the mind quiet. Okay, maunam. Atma vinigraha. Each one of these is very difficult. Atma vinigraha means perfect self-control. Controlling the self. Like if somebody insults you or insults one of your loved ones, the natural impulse is to react and to get angry, to yell at them. You have to restrain yourself. That's self-control. And that requires tremendous restraint of mind, actually. So that's an austerity of mind. So any kind of self-control falls under mental austerity. Bhavasam shuddhirityeta. And bhavasam shuddhi, just to kind of encompass all of them, it's total purification of mind, keeping the mind pure at all times, is mental austerity. So I think it's useful to bring in this Vedantic idea of austerity, this threefold austerity at the level of body, speech, and mind, to kind of round off and complete and deepen the idea of tapas discussed in the Yoga Sutra. I think it's really important. In the Gospel, one day, Naren, the future Swami Vivekananda, comes to visit Sri Ramakrishna along with his friend Bhavanath. And Naren tells Sri Ramakrishna, hey, Bhavanath has just renounced fish and pan, betel leaf. And then, so isn't that such a big austerity? And he's a big renunciate. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, what kind of austerity is that? It's no big deal. Renouncing fish and pan. True austerity is renunciation of lust and greed. And so again, this is more of a Vedantic, correction to, it's just like I'm doing, like bringing in Vedanta as a corrective to the overly kind of physical emphasis on physical hardship in the yogic understanding of austerity. Sri Ramakrishna does the same thing with Bhavanath. He's saying, yeah, okay, that's fine, but don't treat that as a be-all and end-all. They're much more difficult and important austerities to engage in. And you'll notice that links up with the Gita's idea of the mental austerities, actually. Purification of mind is the greatest and highest austerity, and the most challenging. I think in a way, some people obsess so much and harp so much on the more kind of the gross aspects of austerity, like fasting or vegetarianism and this kind of stuff, because it's too much work and it's too difficult to focus on the interior work. You know what I mean? And it's more tangible. Like, yeah, I'm not eating meat, so that's like, wow, I'm great, But dealing with the mind, that's the most difficult thing in the world, right? but that's where we have to get to, each one of us as spiritual aspirants. Okay, so that's tapas. Now, we've got two more niyamas, the fourth and fifth niyamas that we need to be discussed, Svadhyaya and then Ishvara Pranidhana. So Bryant devotes a short paragraph to Svadhyaya on page 253. He says, study, Svadhyaya, refers to reading sacred scriptures whose subject matter is liberation. And the commentators also include the repetition of Om here. Hariharananda expands this to include devotional mantras. He notes that by practicing this niyama, one's desire for worldly objects diminishes and one's taste for spiritual objects increases. Okay, so on the board I wrote that Svadhyaya has these two dimensions. First is reading sacred scriptures whose subject matter is liberation. I like the broadness of this. It's not just saying read the Yoga Sutras, which would be, right? No, any scripture teaching liberation. And so that means the Bhagavata Purana, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, you name it, any number. But why only restricted to Hinduism? Why can't we also encompass the great world's related scriptures as well, right? So any kind of spiritually uplifting reading is included under scriptural reading here. Okay, and then also it includes mantra japa, mental repetition of a mantra. And of course, in the context of the Yoga Sutra, as we talked about, the main mantra is Om, but at the same time, the commentators say, you'll find that, at least in the Hindu context, that divine mantras almost always start with Om, and then it goes on. They have other parts of the mantra, the name of God and so on and so forth, bija mantras and so on. But typically, Om is always a part of it. And so when Patanjali talks about Om, we can think of that as one of the main or fundamental components of the mantra, but then you can also extend the mantra to contain the name of your Ishta Devata, okay? Wanted to mention a few things here. So first of all, with regard to the scriptural study side, so the more jnana, the knowledge side of Svadhyaya, scriptural study, how is that valuable? How does that help us in spiritual life? First of all, it's important that we not think of this as a merely intellectual practice. Like the nerds among us are the ones who will study the scriptures and this and that as a kind of intellectual stimulation or intellectual food. That's one. I don't want to denigrate that, because even that's useful. Because if the mind is thinking about these kinds of things, at least it's not. You're not letting the mind go down to a lower level. Do you see what I mean? So even intellectual stimulation by studying the scriptures is actually very valuable, to the extent that you're keeping the mind on lofty subjects, right, and ideas, rather than on degrading things, right? That's because now we know that attention is a real commodity now, and the entire world is now chasing after, they're trying to grab our attention. So there's social media, there's a million things that are trying to grab our attention. Better that our attention be directed toward a holy scripture than to Instagram and whatever, Okay, so that's the first thing. But at the same time, scriptural study has much deeper value, I would suggest. And I wanted to mention a few examples from our tradition. So Swami Brahmanandaji, whom we worship here, he was the guru of Swami Prabhupada, who's the founding head of the Hollywood Center. He used to say, when the mind starts to sink downward, gravitating toward, sense objects and whatever, different things, or your mind is full of negative thoughts, he says, just recite some uplifting verses from the Gita, he says. And what you'll find is, if you recite those verses with concentration, concentrating on the meaning of the verse, your mind will feel uplifted. This really helps. And that's why I encourage, I'm not looking at anyone in particular here, I encourage people to memorize scriptural verses. Because what are you going to have to, you're not always going to carry books with you. Of course, I'm nerdy enough that I do carry my pocket Gita with me at all times. Why? Because Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel says, even if a sannyasi carries nothing else on his person, he should carry a pocket edition of the Gita. He literally says that in the Gospel. So I try to, if I can't observe the higher teachings, at least I'll observe this. But you can't always crack open the book. And so, memorize some of your favorite verses from your favorite scripture. First of all, it's good. I mean, I grew up in the West, in Boston, and in my K through 12 education, memorization was not too emphasized. And I think that's, in general, I find that in Western education, it's not too emphasized. Whereas in India, it's, I would say, overemphasized. So there's a kind of middle ground but so when I first started when I had to memorize, when I studied Sanskrit as a PhD student at Berkeley, you have to memorize a ton of things with Shabdarupa and all these, Dhaturupa, all these things. And in our Sanskrit class, it was so fun. Our teacher made us memorize one verse basically for every class, and then we had to recite it at the beginning of the class. And they always chose these very spiritual verses. It was really cool. So, and I loved it. I just developed a taste for it, and then I started memorizing the Gita on my own and so on. And then you'll find it's like when you're faced with a particular challenge or difficulty or obstacle in life, that verse that's relevant to that situation will come up in the mind. And then you just repeat it, either verbally, if you're alone, or mentally. And it's like immediately you feel you feel yourself being uplifted. So that's very valuable in itself. So that goes beyond just intellectual stimulation. There are real spiritual benefits. And if you memorize it and you repeat it mentally, it really feels like the verse is bubbling up from within. Because these verses, at least in the Gita and the Upanishads, these kinds of texts, they're mantras. Each verse is actually a mantra. We don't refer to the statements in the Upanishads as verses. We call them mantras. Each one, because the Sanskrit language itself is a divine language. So repeating these mantras in the original language has a power of its own. Okay. A couple other examples. Swami Turiyanandaji, when he was doing austerities. I think this is when he was in Rishikesh. And this is not 2025 Rishikesh, but like circa 1900 something Rishikesh. It's very different now. I went a few months ago and I was kind of disappointed, frankly, because it's so polluted now and it's overrun with tourists and it just doesn't have the same vibe anymore. But when he went, it was like totally secluded. He's alone in his kutia. And somebody noticed that he was reading the Gita. And they asked him, how do you study the Gita? And he said, I study one verse. I just read one verse, and I try to practice it in my daily life. And until I master that teaching, I don't move to the next verse. That's his. So we'd all be stuck at verse 1 if we. But anyway, so he would do that. But to see the sincerity, the integrity, that's the right way to. I don't want. But take the spirit of it, right? That's the idea. Is that the whole purpose of this is it's not for intellectual stimulation, but translate it into daily practice, into our day-to-day lives, assimilate the teaching. And Swamiji, when people asked him, what are you teaching? He says, I teach nothing but the Upanishads. The Upanishads teach nothing but strength. And if you study and you ideally memorize just a few favorite mantras from the Kathopanishad, they're so uplifting because they're mantras and they're suffused with spiritual power. So I recommend all of you memorize at least 1, 2, 3 verses, mantras from the Gita, from the Upanishads, and recite them, and you'll feel the power of the mantras. Okay, so that has to do with the scriptural study side of Swadhyaya, but the japa side. Okay, mantra japa. First of all, some of you are initiated. When you're initiated, the guru will usually tell you, at least in our tradition, meditate morning and evening and do the mantra japa morning and evening and so on. And some people will leave it at that, if they even do that. But ideally, you want to bring japa into the rest of your life as well. When you step out of the meditation room, when you step out of the shrine, what are you doing then? Well, you might say, well, I'm raising my kids. I'm going to work. I'm in rush hour, commuting in rush hour traffic. I'm talking to my coworker. Yeah, but in many of those activities, cooking, cleaning, why can't you also be doing japa at the same time? Right? Just think about it. And that's something that I think we can all do. I mean, it depends on the activity, right? But in a lot of cases, you can do it when you're driving. Why can't you do it? In fact, you'll be much better off than cultivating road rage and, flipping the bird at other drivers. And no, listen to nice bhajans, do japa, right? Holy Mother, when she was asked, what should we do? How do we realize God? She pointed to a clock, the second hand on the clock. She said, see that second hand? Repeat God's name like that second hand. constantly. And she herself, legendarily, and you can try to work out the calculation yourself, I don't know. she said, in the midst of all my activities, I still managed to do 100,000 repetitions of my mantra every single day. 100,000 repetitions. Okay, so if you divide that by the hour and all that, and by you can just, she's doing it quickly, first of all, but I think that it goes deeper than that. I think that when she does it, it's ajapa japa, which means it's non-conscious. I mean, you don't have to consciously or deliberately repeat the mantra. It just happens automatically at a deeper level of the being. So that it's even going on in dream, right? So, see, when we think about it, we're like, we have to exclude the sleeping hours because obviously we're not doing the japa, or most of us aren't doing it, right? But with the Holy Mother, people who are perfected in the mantra, it'll just keep going on even in dream, even in deepless, in dreamless sleep. Okay. Okay. Some other examples regarding japa from our tradition. One time, Rakhal's father comes to visit Sri Ramakrishna. And Rakhal is starting to spend a lot of time with Sri Ramakrishna. And Rakhal is nervous, because his dad is, even though he's a spiritual person, but he's not too pleased that he's spending so much time with Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna really pulls out all the stops and really impresses his father and praising his son. And when he's talking to Rakhal's father, and he says, look, notice how his lips are slightly moving. He's saying he's repeating the mantra. So Rakhal is a good example of somebody who, and it's very quiet. We can contrast Rakhal with Hazra. Hazra was doing japa too, but in a very showy way with the beads, and then criticizing, putting down other people for not doing as much japa as he's doing. And Rakhal, not bothering about anybody else, and nobody knows that he's doing japa. Only Sri Ramakrishna noticed because the lips were just slightly moving, That's a more sattvic way of doing japa. Do it in such a way that it's not visible to others. So one way of doing japa, it's common, especially among Vaishnavas, is to use what's called, in Bengali you call it a tholi, which is a kind of bag that you keep your beads in, and you hold it out, and then you just do it all the time. That's one way. But in our tradition, that's discouraged. Again, because basically you're announcing to the world that you're doing japa. So better to do it in a way that doesn't attract attention to yourself. That would be the more sattvic way to do it. And another example, so the same Hazra, because he's always doing japa and he thinks he's spiritually superior to other people for doing more japa than them, Sri Ramakrishna says, give me those beads. And he takes the beads in his right hand first. And he tries to do some japa with it, and he can't. He can't even move the beads at all. And then he switches to his left hand, which is considered the impure hand in Hindu culture. And he starts turning the beads. He turns it once, turns it twice, and then stops again because he goes into samadhi. So another really important thing about doing mantra japa is just taking God's name is good, even if there's no feeling behind it, even if it's mechanical. But even better, much better, is having some feeling behind the repetition. And so there's another example. Balaram Bosh, one of the great householder disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, his father would often come to visit Sri Ramakrishna, and they were great Vaishnavas. And so he would be doing japa constantly in Sri Ramakrishna's room. And then Sri Ramakrishna, in a room full of people, notices Balaram's father doing japa, and then turns to the rest of the people and says, why is it that for people like him, he points to him, that 1 year seems to have 16 months? And he starts laying into him. He's a very pious, holy, spiritual person, this Balaram's father. And he's very elderly by that time. And I'm making the story a little bit. So, and he says, if you go to Kolkata, you'll see prostitutes. Even they're doing japa. So what does he mean? So he's not criticizing the prostitutes. It's great that the prostitutes are doing japa. That's good. But he's saying, yes, it's good to do japa. It's always good to take God's name. But the next step for Balaram's father, who does so much japa, is to try to infuse it with more of the spirit of longing for God. Vyakulata in Bengali, Vyakulata. Okay, so especially when we sit for meditation. See, there's a difference. When we're sitting in meditation and we're trying to follow our Guru's instructions about mantra japa, it's really important to do it with concentration and try to bring some feeling into it. Like some kind of prayerful attitude. One way to do this is doing japa in the second person. This is, I don't know if someone else has said this, but this is the language that I came up with. Doing japa in the second person. What do I mean? It means when you're taking God's name, every time you repeat the mantra, it's like you're addressing God. You're calling on God literally by using his name. It's like a parent calling on his or her child. You know what I mean? Hey, Bob or Sam or Rajiv, you know? It's like that. You're calling on God. That automatically makes the japa, the repetition of the mantra, prayerful. And that automatically brings some feeling into it. Like it brings a personal, kind of more intimate touch to the mantra japa practice. That's just one example, but there are many of it. Just try to, however you could do it, try to bring some feeling into the mantra. Another thing that some people find helpful is before you go into the mantra japa, listen to some uplifting spiritual bhajan, some kind of song, or sing a song yourself, or sing a stotra, some kind of hymn, devotional hymn or something, just to like bring your mind, tune it in a higher mood, and then do the japa so that it doesn't feel as mechanical. Okay. But then, when you're out of the meditation room, you're doing japa and rush hour traffic and this and that, or when you're cooking or when you're cutting vegetables, you don't need to try to bring in feeling there. You can just do it, but that's great because it's better to keep your mind occupied with high thoughts and with the name of God than any million of other things that you could be occupying your mind with, right? Okay. So that is Swadhyaya, and so now we can talk about Ishvara Parinidhana. And actually, we could probably just wrap up today's class by completing the Niyamas. So, bottom of page 253 into 254. Vyasa here defines the last item on Patanjali's list, devotion to God, Ishvara Pranidhana, which has already received a good deal of attention. And he mentions the sutras from book 1.23 and following. As offering all one's activities to Ishvara. That's the Karma Yoga side of Ishvara Pranidhana. To Ishvara, the original teacher. Okay. In resonance with the Gita 2.47, where this is one of the primary teachings, such offerings must be done without desire for the fruit. Okay, famous verse in chapter 2 of the Gita, Karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. You have the right to action, to work. Krishna is telling Arjuna. And in his case, the work is to fight, right? For justice. Ma phaleshu kadachana, but you do not have the right to the fruits of your actions. Okay, which means don't be so outcome-oriented when you engage in your actions, when you fulfill your duties. Don't be so obsessed about success or failure. If you're a student, obsessing about grades, for instance. If you're an adult and you're looking for a promotion or a raise or that job, you go for a job interview. Don't be so outcome-oriented. Do your best, leave the rest. This is the standard Indian slogan for Karma Yoga. You do your best from your side. Leave the rest to God. That's the idea, okay? Because success and failure is not in our hands, that's in God's hands. Okay, so that's Karma Yoga. Ramananda Saraswati quotes 2 devotional verses to illustrate this. This is from chapter 9 of the Gita. Whatever I do, oh wait, this is not chapter 9 of the Gita, this is different. Okay, whatever I do, whether with or without desire, whether auspicious or inauspicious, I do it to offer it all to you as directed by you. And, quote, let all my daily activities in this life or future lives, whether in deed, thought, or word, be dedicated in devotion to Krishna. In fact, the sources are not cited here, and maybe they were just well known, but maybe not necessarily from any scripture. But clearly these verses explain Karma Yoga, right? Whatever you do, do it as an offering to the divine. And that doesn't just mean quote-unquote religious things, like when you're doing puja or arati or doing japa. Why can't you also offer raising your children to God and trying to see the divine even in your children? Going to work, why don't you do that as an offering as well? And one simple way to do work as an offering is to just repeat a kind of mantra at the beginning of your work, and try to visualize, at least just mentally, just think about God at the beginning of the work. Repeat the mantra, and then start the work. Once in a while, I know that during the work it's hard to think of God, right? But just in the middle of the work, just, once or twice, try to think of God. And then when you've completed the work, offer what you just did to God. And you can also offer a kind of closing mantra as well. So I think it's useful to have like a kind of opening mantra before the work and mentally think of God. Do the work, and then again, offer the work to God and do a closing mantra. That just kind of, it makes everything you do, it kind of spiritualizes everything, every activity that you engage in. Okay. One might draw attention here to numerous verses in the Gita where Krishna makes statements such as, this is the chapter 9, verse 27, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you sacrifice, whatever you give away, whatever austerities you perform, O Arjuna, do it as an offering to me. So notice, so the Sanskrit is yat karoshi, yadashnasi, yad juhoshi, dadasi, yat tapasya kaunteya, tat kurushu malaparnam. See, most of those activities are actually quote-unquote religious ones. Yat ashnasi, yat juhoshi. Juhoshi is sacrifice, right? So sacrifice, austerity, so on. Those are traditionally religious activities. But notice the very first verb that Krishna uses, whatever you do, across the board, without any exceptions or any distinction between secular and non-secular, religious, non-religious. No. Literally anything you do. It could be showering. It could be getting up in the morning. Very religious people, they wake up and they take God's name. Right before they go to bed, they'll take God's name. And like people like Holy Mother and these, these great saints, even in sleep, they'll also be taking God's name, right? So no matter what you're doing, do it as an offering to the divine. This reminds me of an incident with Girish. I probably mentioned this many times, so sorry if I bore you, but it is a quite striking incident. There's some new people here. So, Girish Ghosh, the famous Bohemian devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, he was also a drunk, and he was an alcoholic before he gave up drinking. And he would come to Sri Ramakrishna sometimes dead drunk. And Sri Ramakrishna was so kind and compassionate and forgiving. And Girish kind of helplessly asked him once, how do I overcome this bad habit? And Sri Ramakrishna says, don't worry. Next time you have an urge to drink, offer that drink to Divine Mother first. And so he did that. So then he's got a Gita to back him up. 9.27, whatever you do, including drinking vodka, offer it to God first. But then what happened as a result? He did it a few times, but then he found, wait a minute, I don't want to offer this to God. I want to offer good things to God. I want to give my best to God. And he gave up the habit. He dropped the habit. Remarkable. Okay. Vijnana Bhikshu. This is one of the later commentators on the Yoga Sutra. Despite his own personal Vaishnavite orientations, which are usually evident in his references when discussing the Ishvara element, displays the admirable Hindu penchant for conceptualizing Ishvara as manifest in a myriad of forms by quoting in his Yoga Sutra commentary on this sutra a verse to Shiva. So, sorry, that was a long sentence, but the point is, Vijnana Bhikshu is a Vaishnava commentator, a Vedantic Vaishnava. But here's his verse. He quotes a verse worshipping Shiva. The worship of Ishvara consists of firm devotion to Shiva by means of praise, remembrance, and worship through one's words, thoughts, body, and actions. So, Hinduism. Many people mistakenly think that Hinduism is polytheistic. Others, and some Hindus, will say, no, we're not polytheists, we're monotheists. And that's closer to the truth, but I personally feel that a better way, a more accurate way to think about the doctrine of Hinduism is, and it's a mouthful, but I think it's accurate, polymorphic monism. And in fact, look at that, one of my bookmarks is, so right after I gave a class on A Tale of Two Hinduisms, or no, in the midst of the class, I said, I explained the 4 core principles of Hinduism. I said, you guys, one of you should make business cards out of these 4 principles. And within a week, somebody went, I didn't ask anybody individually. She then said, hey, I made some business cards with the 4 principles. So she's got this is kind of amazing. It's Mario Kart themed. And so it's got Mario, it's got Toad, the mushroom. And it says, understanding Hinduism, a polymorphic monistic religion. One player, many avatars. And then it's got the 4 basic tenets of Hinduism. Anyway, so polymorphic monism, that's the Hindu doctrine. What is that? I think that's basically what Bryant is saying here. Monism, because there's only one divine. Polymorphic, because that one divine is manifesting in countless forms. Okay, and so that's what Vijnana Bhikshu is channeling here. Even though he's a Vaishnavite, he loves Krishna, he knows that Shiva is also the same divine in a different form. So is Kali, and so is Christ, and so is Allah, and so on. Okay? Then, the last paragraph. Vachaspati Mishra considers devotion to Ishvara to be the most important of all the yamas and niyamas. Okay. So we've discussed 5 niyamas, and what this commentator, Vachaspati Mishra, who's one of the most important traditional commentators, what he says is, out of all 5, this is actually the most important out of all of them, devotion to God. Why? As we will see below, cultivating the yamas and niyamas produces beneficial results. So all the 5 yamas and all the 5 niyamas. But it is only from Ishvara Pranidhana that the ultimate result of yoga, namely samadhi, is gained. 2.45. So we're going to discuss 2.45 a few classes from now. But the verse, the sutra says, Samadhi siddhi Ishvara Pranidhanat. You achieve samadhi siddhi, you achieve perfection in samadhi through Ishvara Pranidhana, which is the 5th of the niyamas. It's singling out that last of the 5 niyamas as the practice which is necessary to attain perfection in samadhi. So that does seem to privilege this practice out of all the niyamas in that way. And then Bryant also says, it is important to note again here that although Ishvara Pranidhana was optional as a method of meditation in the first chapter, do you remember this? This goes way back, months ago. Ishvara Pranidhanad va. There's that word va at the end of the sutra, which means or. Which means it's optional. And it gave a bunch of practices before that. You could do X, you could do Y, or you could do Ishvara Pranidhana. You can be devoted to God. You could practice bhakti. It was optional. Here, no option. This is a mandatory niyama. It's not that you can, drop one of them. No, you have to do all 5 as much as possible. That's the idea. So here it's mandatory. It's built into the 8-limbed yoga, the Ashtanga yoga. So bhakti is mandatory for everybody, actually. As with the requirements of Kriya Yoga at the beginning of this chapter, what is the reference here? The very first sutra of book 2 was Tapaha Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani Kriya Yogaha. So now we can link the first sutra of book 1 to 2.32, the niyamas, because I should write this with the red marker. So basically, Kriya Yoga are these 3, 4, and 5. These 3 together equal Kriya Yoga. Now my handwriting is even worse. Oh my goodness. Okay, Kriya Yoga. Don't get this confused with Paramahamsa Yogananda's Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga itself can mean different things in different systems and different traditions. Kriya Yoga, as defined by Patanjali, means these 3 practices. Tapaha, Swadhyaya, Ishvara, Pranidhana. And those 3 elements, the 3 components of Kriya Yoga, are the last 3 niyamas of the 5 niyamas in the Ashtanga Yoga. And then there's this whole scholarly question of why the heck is there this overlap? What's going on here? And some scholars will say that, well, it's because the text itself is a composite one, and Ashtanga Yoga is the main practice taught in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but then somebody adds in later this Kriya Yoga or something like that. They'll have these kinds of theories. Bryant, I think, plausibly argues that need not be the case. And that both of them, there can be overlap, but at the same time, it could be the same author. Okay, and we don't need to go into the details there, but okay, good. Maybe we can stop there. But any questions about any of the niyamas? Easy enough. This, as I said, it gives a kind of comprehensive spiritual practice for our day-to-day spiritual life. That's what I think is so helpful and practical about these things. Can you give the mic to Pranava? It doesn't. Regardless of how simple it is, we want the online people to be able to hear it.
Maharaj, just wondering,
Yeah.
do you have a book that you like to recommend for the yamas and niyamas? A translation or something?
Well, this is good. This is the textbook we use for.
Bryant's book?
Yeah, Edwin Bryant's is good for that. Yeah. Nothing else comes. I mean, there are lots of books on the Yoga Sutras, but I don't know in particular which ones go into the details of Yama Niyama really well. So anybody online too who has suggestions, put it in the YouTube comments, and then we can. Yeah. Anyone else? Any comments or thoughts about the Niyamas that we discussed today? No? We're all good? All right, thank you, everyone. As I said, I'm not sure when the next class will be, but it will be sometime in December, probably. Okay, thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.